welcome to the New York PHP Meetup. If you're sitting around the room or at the back, if you wouldn't mind coming and filling some of the seats here, it's nicer for the presenters to have faces to look at rather than empty seats. That would be excellent. So welcome. This is the PHP New York Meetup. This is our second meetup here and our third meetup of the year. We're trying to kick things back off after a bit of a hiatus from the group for sort of 18 months, 2 years or so. So we want representation for PHP folks in New York. If you know any other PHP developers, please encourage them to come along. You can learn some good things. People always find that they're surprised by the topics that we present on and the new things that they can explore in the PHP world. So this meetup is graciously sponsored by HelloFresh. They have provided the pizza for us, so round of applause for them. Thank you so much. And we have a talk later by Mohannad, which is going to be on lessons in engineering leadership, harnessing the power of narrative. I don't know what that means, but it sounded intriguing, so hopefully you guys will all find that exciting. We've got a couple of lightning talks going on this evening. We've got Rohit, Sodhia talking about JSON web tokens, Auth made easier. So if you don't know what JSON web tokens are, or JWTs, tune in for that. And we've also got Michael Butler, who works here at Tumblr, on speeding up your PHP unit tests with Paratest. Speaking of working for Tumblr, if you are interested in coming to check out our engineering division, we have a fairly large engineering team based here in this building on the floor below. We are currently aggressively hiring. We've got a bunch of open positions. We're looking to expand over the next 18 months. So if you do PHP, if you do iOS, if you do Android, if you do security, if you do AdOps, whatever it might be, we may have a role open. So I would encourage you to hit up tumblr.com/jobs, which should give you the latest on what jobs we have available. So I'm going to, without further ado, welcome Rohit to the stage, and he's going to talk to you about JSON web tokens. Please give him a round of applause.
All right. Hey, guys. My name's Rohit. And yeah, I'm going to be talking a little bit about JWTs. I apologize. This is my first time giving a talk, so if I'm rushed or anything, just someone raise your hand, tell me to slow down, but hopefully we'll go. So like I mentioned, my name's Rohit. I was a PHP dev until 4 weeks ago when Clover Health picked me up. I am now in the Python world. If anyone's interested in health tech, in Python, get in touch with me. We're building a new team in New York City. I've loved the company, and I've only been there 4 weeks, so it's been pretty great. As most people, I'm on Twitter, I'm on GitHub. I launched my first PHP package like 6 months ago or so. I've been actively working on it. So I'm trying to get more involved in the community at large. So JSON web tokens. There we go. If anyone has done anything on authentication, at some point you've probably seen a string like that and been absolutely terrified because WordPress decided that was really smart. So far, anytime you've been trying to authenticate, you need some sort of way to identify the user and you need some way to authenticate the user. WordPress uses a three-part schema, username, and then 2 tokens separated by a user ID and then a token separated by, I never remember what the long bar is called. Pipes, there we go. The problem with this sort of setup, though, is it is stateful. This requires some connection to an individual database or an individual server that tells it that this means something. And the other problem is everyone was coming up with their own method of authentication. So if you needed to authenticate against someone else, you needed to know their schema, or they needed to have an API available. You needed some sort of connection, so you could never isolate to your own system. So my screen freezes. So in comes JSON web tokens. They're actually nothing fancy. They're an implementation of an existing RFC. It's long, it's complicated. I tried reading it to give you guys some idea of what it actually meant, but basically just learning about web tokens is the big part. Essentially what this calls for is a three-part header, three-part string, a header, a payload, and a signature. And you You do get something a little messy, like you see down below. But I, for example, prefer that it's broken by periods rather than, for example, a pipe. That looks like an L as far as I'm concerned. It's hard to read. And in the end, this actually can end up being a lot shorter than a lot of other schemas that exist today while containing a heavier payload, which means more data is being sent with lighter traffic. So what are the advantages to a JWT? First of all, it's a standard. There's one way to build a JWT, and anyone can then look it up and theoretically decode that. Second, it's stateless. If you have a microservice system, if you've got cloud servers that spool up or spool down depending on how much traffic you've got, JWTs will continue to work. They reduce server load because, as we saw on the previous screen, part of it is they contain a payload. So you can send data back and forth in this JWT, and so that means theoretically you can do fewer SQL requests, fewer API calls, and contain more data. And compared to other standards that exist, JWTs are pretty compact. So, as we all know, the less payload, faster load times. So, 3 parts. The first part is the header. The header has basically 2 things, although the standard does call for more. You tell it what type of algorithm you're hashing with, and you tell it what type of token you've got. In our case, JWTs. This is obviously really light, really small, but it tells you everything you need to later decode this very token. You have a payload. Payloads can have a whole bunch of stuff in them. There are a few reserved items. There are a few public items, private items. You can find this all out on jwt.io on a couple different websites. But this contains all sorts of information. You can have, for example, IDs. You can have names. You can have expiration dates. And this is information that can be sent back and forth. This is where you'd include the information that the client side is going to use to decode to figure out what name to present, how to authenticate, how to display information. You can include, for example, profile URLs. So all sorts of useful information there. And the signature. So this is where you start to actually authenticate, where you start to make some secrets. So JWTs use base64 encoding. You take the header and the payload, base64 encode each, and then you take a secret that you design, whatever you want, something obviously that's going to be unique to your system, and then you base64 encode all of that, and you get a new string out of it. And you basically get this. The first part is a base64 encoded version of your header. The second part, a base64 encoded version of your body, and then the signature as the last slide showed. And the RFC calls for using the authentication bearer header. So you just throw this in your bearer token. So the advantages. It is decodable everywhere. This is a standard. So this means whether you're using PHP, you're using Python, you're using JavaScript, you can decode this token. This also means that nothing in the token is secure. Just like you'd have in any information that goes between a server and a client, whatever's in here, someone can decode. But the secret is, of course, that secret you've got at the end. You can't authenticate unless you know whatever your secret key is. It's stateless, as I mentioned. Because this doesn't need any information from any database, from any particular server, you can always pick it up, move it to another server, send it to a client, and they'd be able to use it. You can transmit a lot of data in relatively small space, which can become really nice if you don't want to make continual server calls. If you only want to send the user information once, and then never make another user API call or user database call, you can pack it all in there. And yeah, like I said, language agnostic. So a real quick demo to show you guys what this is. Okay, so it is actually really, really easy. Oh, sorry, this is really tiny. 1 sec, I need to figure out how to do that. Ah, yes. Okay, is that, let me make it a little larger. Okay. So there are a ton of packages you can use. I happen to be a fan of this particular package. I've used it in a couple of projects. it is really easy to use. This is all you need to set up a token. You define a signer. I'm using SHA-256. There are a whole variety you can use. And creating a token in this case is very simple. You just pass it a bunch of options, as you can see up here, and get token literally creates it for you. For example, so I'm just going to pass it my name, my email. I need to fix Xdebug. And so I get back this token. Now, if I copy this and decode. Decoding is also stupidly easy. For example, in this one, all you have to do is call the parser class, and that essentially spits it out. Oh, let me do this. So as you can see on the bottom here, this is basically where it becomes a little more authenticated. You can see I have a line 3/4 of the way down that says verified, and this RQ4 just happens to be the same secret I had in the other file. So if I do PHP decode and so you can see it spits back the same data it had earlier, and this one will verify. If I instead change that token to another, yeah. And then I run it again. This time it doesn't verify. So if someone was making a request against my server, they sent a JWT, I verify what it is. If it doesn't verify, I know they're not authenticated, even if it contains the exact user information that it's supposed to contain. If it doesn't verify, I know it's invalid. This could be, maybe it timed out. Maybe someone's trying to hack in, someone's trying to spoof the server into thinking. So yeah, and like I said, it is cross-language, which if I can remember where I put this. For example, there are JavaScript packages for this. So I created a simple little page. I can decode this in JavaScript. So this means on the front end, the user is now using it. I have the entire payload, and the user can, I can now use any of that user information. So I have name and email. I could have profile information. I could have rights, roles. But again, because this is JavaScript, we all know this is insecure. So you don't put any private information that you wouldn't want otherwise publicly available. But yeah, that's JWTs in a nutshell. They're super useful, super great, especially in today's modern world of microservices and cloud servers, spooling things up, taking things down, sharing information. They're a big advantage over more traditional cookie session-based systems. So yeah, that's, wait, did I have anything? Oh, okay, yeah, sorry. If you want to go to jwt.io, it's a fantastic website. They have a live debugger. You can play around, test, try it out, as well as a list of, I think when I counted, there were some 78 libraries among 12.5 languages. So there's a lot out there. That's it. Cool, thank you.
All right, thank you, Rohit. Does anybody have any questions? I'm sure there are questions out there. Right, let me run a mic out to you. I think there's one on the floor somewhere still. The one on the floor? No, that's in my hand. All right. I'm coming through. Sorry. Here we go.
Hello. First of all, thank you for the presentation. I've heard of JWTs, but I've never seen it described so succinctly and interestingly. You said how we're passing a private key as part of the header, as part of the JWT. So is this a public key that you're signing it with?
No, so you don't pass a key in the, here, let me actually get that slide. I think the meetup kick, yeah, one sec, let me rejoin this and I'll actually bring up that slide. So you're not actually passing the token itself. Instead, what you're passing is, so what you're actually passing is a signature. Your secret key will be part of the signature, but it's encoded. So you're never going to directly pass that key. This is just when you recreate the signature later on, you'll compare it. Does that make sense?
When you say encoded, you're talking about base64, or you're hashing?
No. So like in this case, the header contains what method you're using to hash it. So like in this case, it's using SHA-256. And that's why the header contains the information, because when you get it back, you could theoretically have 3 different types of JWTs with different hashes. The JWT will tell you which hash to use to try to compare it. It's all self-contained.
So it's the idea, if you go back to the previous slide, your header will say, I'm using SHA-256. So that's your wrapping function on the outside there, which is the SHA-256. And the payload that you send down when you do your exchange of username and password, or whatever it is you do to generate the token, that is going to send down the base64 encoded header, the base64 encoded payload, and a secret, which the server can then use to validate when you send that token back up that the server itself signed it in the first place, so that nobody could spoof and make a fake one and send it up.
Yeah, and the nice thing is it's not actually that server made it. Because it's all self-contained, you already have the header, you already have the body, and the signature is based on the header and the body.
Right, so long as
as long as the secret is the same.
Yes, so long as the server that's validating it has access to that same private secret, then you're good.
Yeah,
and obviously
exactly.
You would never want to put that secret in a client-side application. That would be a bad
Yeah,
thing.
in fact, when I searched, there's no JavaScript package that exists that actually validates. Because they all take into account the fact that you should never be having a secret in a client side.
Not even a Node package?
Okay, sorry. So I actually didn't dive into the Node stuff. I was looking client-side JavaScript.
Yep.
Yes, there are Node packages for it.
Makes sense.
Thank you.
I have a question. So the payload, you said that obviously that's just base64 encoded. It's not encrypted in any form. So what kind of information would you actually want to embed in there?
So yeah, that kind of stuff. Most of what I've seen in usage and research are basically the same kind of public items that you might otherwise have in tokens we use today. So things like usernames, user IDs, emails, if that's something that's public within your system, profile. So I've sent profile avatars, because this means that basically this gets kept in the system, and theoretically, if I wanted to move it to another server, they'd still have the URL that my avatar, for example, might be on.
But if the avatar changed, then that token would become invalid, or?
No, so that was, as long as the token lives, that'll be there. But one of the reserved keys, ISS, is the expiration, or I think it's it's EXP, is the expiration, and you can then in your own system validate, check if the token is still valid or not, and then make another request to your server to reconfirm or generate a new token.
Cool. Anyone else? Oh, we got another one. I'll bring this. Oh, there you go.
So say you're using this to authenticate people making requests against an API, so it's going to be a long-running token, theoretically months, possibly years in existence. What do you do if you find that you've somehow let your signing token, get committed into your Git history, and you need to just expire? Is there any way to just globally nuke any and all tokens from being available?
No, and that's partially because, again, it's stateless. So this token, once it's generated and once it's sent to the client, doesn't exist anywhere other than on the client. And so the only way to know whether it's valid or not is to do the comparison. And then, for example, one of the reserved items, like I said, is EXP expired. You can compare the token to what you know is valid information and see if that is correct.
I guess then in that scenario, if you had committed your signing key, or just it somehow got out into the wild, you could change that. No authentication requests against that would pass.
Correct.
So you didn't just have to deal with a bunch of pissed off emails with people being like, my client and credentials don't work anymore.
So a common method with JWTs is it can slow down authentication a little bit, but when you verify, generate a new token and send that back with that main body. Mm-hmm. And so essentially every time a request is made, you have the latest essentially valid token. And so if, for example, you end up in that scenario, you now make that request. You can build it in some sort of system where if it comes back and it verifies against this bad token, mm-hmm. decide how I want to handle it. Do I want to send the user now back to the login page? Do I instead want to go ahead like, yeah, this is fine. It was low security risk. I'm just going to generate a new token with the correct header and then pass that one back.
Riding dirty, I like that.
I guess it all comes down to how secure. I mean, if you committed to a GitHub that only you have access to, I guess it wouldn't be that bad, but no.
Security experts in the room's head
Famous
just
last
exploded.
As you can see, I'm not a security engineer.
But I guess you could encode within the payload a version number for what key you're using.
Yeah,
Not the key itself, but just like key number 1, key number 2, key number 3, and if what came through had a key number less than the current one, you can make the decision: do I want to accept it? Do I want to block it? Do I want to?
I've also seen version dates. So people rotate their keys every 3 months, and so part of the payload will contain a date, and this is the last date that this key can be used.
Right. So you can have like this is the last time it can be used, and this is when it's up for refresh.
Yep.
And if the user hits in the refresh period, they just get issued a new one. But if they hit outside of the refresh and after it's expired, they
Send back some info, log back in. Yep.
Cool. Awesome. Any other questions? Great stuff. Thank you very much. Round of applause. Okay, next up, we're going to have Michael Butler talking to us about speeding up your unit tests. And I'll hand it over to him.
Yeah.
Oh.
Now I have to go back. All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Michael. I work at Tumblr. And I'm here to talk to you about parallel unit testing with Paratest. Now, I guess everyone maybe, if they have a really large, unit testing suite, might have their own kind of homegrown solutions for running, running unit tests, speeding them up, getting them to pass in a short amount of time. But I'll be talking specifically about Paratest with some kind of alternatives in the end. Okay, so overall, I'll tell you about a problem statement, the how-to, how to use it, some of the caveats and challenges with it, and how to deal with code coverage. And this is a tool that we actually use here at Tumblr. It's able to speed up our test suite by a good amount. Like when we started out, I think it was like 8 to 10 minutes to run the entire test suite, and now it's down to about 25 seconds on our dev servers, which are 12 core CPU. So yeah, what really is the issue here? So simply put, the more number of tests you have, the more time it's going to take to run. So, and the bad thing about that is with unit tests, you want to have the tests pass in the shortest amount of time possible to give you better feedback, right? Because if tests are taking too long to run, you're not going to be running them as often, right? Because it takes too much time, and then like things will break and you'll find out about it later and all that kind of stuff. You want to kind of optimize to run tests very quickly, frequently as well. So that's really why we're trying to do this. So in comes Paratest, right? Basically, at its core, it's all written in PHP that uses like inter-process communication. There's a parent process that you run. So instead of running PHPUnit, you're going to be running Paratest kind of as your test runner, and it's going to read the PHPUnit XML. All like most of the options are supported, so you don't really need to customize your project much at all. You just like compose or install it, and just switch over the test runner to Paratest. It's gonna basically parse through all of your test suite and split it up into different like chunks, and then run each chunk in a sub process in parallel. So the parent process is going to be like listening for the the output streams from those sub-processes to find out if there was errors, what passed, what failed, you know, if it crashed, all those kind of things. And then finally at the end, it's going to capture all that output and then, you know, generate a report if it needs to, or present to the user and so on. But it also updates progress along the way. And I'll give you an example. Yeah, so how to do it is very simple, right? You just basically run composer require, dev Brianium Paratest. That's the developer who actually wrote this years ago. He stopped maintaining it basically, and the maintenance has been picked up by a group of devs just in the community, and I'm one of them. Like I've helped contribute a little bit to it and you know, help out with issues. We've actually moved it to a separate repo. So it's not under that developer's name anymore. It's still under that name under packages, but it's now under, you can get it on GitHub, Paratest PHP/Paratest. But if you just Google PHP Paratest, you'll find it. Once you install it, you just simply run vendor bin paratest. You can specify the number of processes. You can give it a path to your tests. You don't. That's all the options are optional. It'll just use your unit XML as is if needed. You can also specify a separate runner class. So there's different runner classes where you can kind of find what fits best for you. So like you could see here, I passed in this wrapper runner. So wrapper runner is actually going to spin up the processes and then keep them open forever until like all the tests are done. So it's going to be rerunning the test in the same process, which will give you a really nice speed boost. But there's some big caveats with that if your tests have like involve global state, because it's going to start, you know, because maybe it's not going to be tearing down the data properly, and that depends on how your tests are written. So let's see what else I have here. Yeah, so actually, let me give you, before I get into that, let's see if I can run this here. Okay, so I've been trying this all day. I was trying to find a good like test project that doesn't have Paratest at all, so I can just drop it in and use it. And there are some issues with doing that into a test suite that wasn't prepared to, you know, run tests in this way, and maybe has like a lot of like global state or is writing to the file system under like a hard-coded file path. So in this example, I downloaded Twig, which is a template framework for Symfony, but any project can use it. Now their test suite is, you can see it's about 1,400 tests. And if you run PHPUnit normally, it's actually pretty fast. So this is not really a good example, but I also didn't want to be like waiting around all day, waiting for tests to pass. But this will finish in about 8 to 10 seconds. Okay, in this case, 11 seconds. That's just normal PHP unit. Now, so what I did was I installed Paratest, and I'm going to run it under 4 processes using the wrapper runner. And that may or may not run actually faster than running PHPUnit alone, which is kind of an interesting caveat. You can see here 9 seconds, but between runs, right, it could vary anyway, depending on how the test suite is written. So why is that though? Why is it not, why is it not running in 2.5 seconds, right? If there was 4 processes, well, there's actually some overhead for starting up the test suite because it has to parse the entire suite and then chunk it out. So that depends on the size of the code base. And then when all the processes are finished, it needs to then process the data and kind of compile it into this one file. So that's like some of the reasons why it's not as fast. So I think you're better off like seeing what fits best for you. It might not work in all projects, but if your test suite's running and like taking like 10 minutes to run, this could be a nice solution that doesn't really take a lot of effort to get working. Yeah, so as far as the caveats go, yeah, so like I already mentioned, parallel is actually not always faster, just for the reasons I talked about. You know, for example, if you have a really process-intensive bootstrap in your unit test, like let's say you're spinning up maybe like a service, like a Redis server or Memcache or even like a SQL table or something, that could be pretty time-consuming. So what Paratest is going to do is each process is going to have to run that bootstrap individually. And that leads us into point 2. If you have some issues with global state, that's also going to be an issue, because like each process is going to be running the same bootstrap. So if you don't have like a unique identifier for various global state, like whether it's like a MySQL server or something, 2 processes are going to collide or try to write to the same file. They're going to try to write to the same table, who knows what. So your best bet is if your unit test suite is a pure unit test suite, in such that there's no global state, and each test is basically tearing down the entire thing every time, or better yet, if your methods are running by with pure dependency injection, accepting arguments and working off that purely, you'll have better luck running with Paratest. But if you have a test suite like that anyway, it's probably really fast. So maybe it won't even help that much anyway. The other interesting thing is process isolation can hide problems in your code. So if you're kind of like using, if you start using parallel tests like this as a crutch to speed up your tests, well, I should say, if you use it to speed up your tests, you can start then depending on the running in parallel as a crutch to actually tear down your global state. So what I mean by this is, so the default runner for Paratest is actually running each test file in a separate process. So it's actually going to bootstrap, run that one test file, and then tear down. So it's going to be doing a lot of bootstrapping. That could be kind of nice if you are worried about global state, because then you're guaranteed that only one file is going to be sharing global state. It's not going to be interacting with any other possible test file. So if over time you do that a lot, you're going to run into maybe issues where then if you try to run a test in a different fashion, like in a single process or something, or maybe you're generating code coverage in a different way, then the test might fail because some test somewhere didn't, implement the right teardown logic or something like that. Or even maybe it depended on some setup logic from a different test that you didn't know about. So that could be an issue. So I think the goal is really to make sure you have solid setup and teardown phases of your tests. Keep them really isolated. Yeah, so what about code coverage? This can get complex. Paratest does have support for code coverage, where each process will generate its own code coverage to a certain temp file. Then the parent process will read the output of that temp file and kind of combine it as it goes along and merge it. But if you have a really big code base with a ton of files, each coverage file is going to be huge and take a long time to generate, and it's just going to explode the amount of time it's going to take and memory, especially over time. So unless your code base is pretty small, I wouldn't recommend running Paratest with code coverage. But there are actually solutions for doing this. So yeah, the first thing I would recommend is just run your code coverage in a single process, normally with PHPUnit. Don't try to use Paratest for it. But if that's taking too long, like maybe 30 minutes, an hour, or something like that, there are options. So what we've done actually is for running our code coverage, we've used Ant. So we use Ant as a task runner, and Ant has a native way to run tasks in parallel. You could just throw a parallel tag in there and then specify some subtasks. So what we've done is, and I think I have it here in VS Code. This is just like a snippet. So we have this target here for PHPUnit. I called it cov combine here. It's basically going to run, you can see here in parallel, 5 threads, a bunch of like subdirectories, right? And each of these is actually targeting a sub-target, which basically just use that path as what the test is going to run with coverage. It's going to write each process is going to write the coverage to a certain file based on like the path, and then once all the parallel tests are done, we're going to sleep for a couple seconds. That's because for like very large files, you might not have finished streaming the files to disk, even though the task is finished. And it's going to run this really nice, cool tool called PHP Cov, which is also written by the PHPUnit devs, I believe. It's just a handy tool that could be used to easily combine multiple coverage files into one file for you, so you don't have to write a script to do that or anything. And that's what that does. It just combines it to a single file, deletes the temp files, and you're done. So this has enabled us to reduce our coverage job to, I think, about 6 minutes, 6.5 minutes, which is really nice. Yeah, and the main reason for it being so slow, I believe, is just how Xdebug works, and because it has to generate coverage for your entire code base and everything, depending on your whitelist and all that stuff. So that's really, the combination of these tools have really enabled us to cut down on our PHPUnit tasks. Yeah, that's pretty much all I had for you guys. So.
All right, big hand for Michael.
If you have any questions, feel free.
I bet there are questions. I certainly have a question. Who's going first? Okay. Again, I'm coming through.
Thank you. You said how Paratest chunks the tests into different sub-processes. It seems like, is there a way to tell it where to chunk? Because that can take care of some of the problems of grouping different tests that have to bootstrap together.
Yeah, I don't believe there's a way to do that unless you implemented your own test runner. So the default test runner is just going to look in the subdirectory for tests and get all the test methods of those classes, and then just chunk them out evenly, by file or whatever. You could write your own test runner for that, I believe. And that way you could like define your own list of like chunks and then have it just return that list that you define instead of actually parsing through. So that could be one way to do that. There's one other thing I didn't mention is somebody recently wrote an SQLite runner wrapper. So instead of using the inter-process communication, which like I think might have issues on like Windows or something, it uses an SQLite runner, which will write the tests to an SQL like file, and then the sub processes will actually read off that SQLite database. Although I'm not familiar with how that works with like locking and everything with multi-threading, but it worked for them. So yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Thanks for your question.
Anyone else? Just pass the mic around.
Hi. You said your test is about 6 minutes something. Can you tell us a little bit about what you did in fine-tuning, number of parallel processes to run? Did you experiment, went with what you ended up, and what did you experiment with?
Yeah, the 6 minute figure, 6.5 is actually, it's the coverage. So without coverage turned on, right, because Xdebug slows it down, without coverage it's about 25 seconds, but yeah, to get to that number for the coverage, I was experimenting mainly with seeing how long the tests took by like subdirectory level. Digging in like 2-3 levels deep to really find out where the time-consuming tests were. but at the same time, we don't want to run it in too many threads. Like we wanted to limit the amount of threads because each thread is going to be running a separate process, and it's going to have access to that, all that PHP memory, which is it's going to be consuming. So that's something we had to watch out for as well. But yeah, it was a lot of like just trial and error, and seeing where the slowest parts were, and just separate, forking off when it got to when it was taking too long, we would fork off that into a different process.
So it's a bit like when you have like a performance problem and you just keep changing values until it goes fast, and you're like, cool, it worked. Next ticket.
Exactly.
Don't do that. Cool. Anyone else? All right. Was that hand? No. I have a question. What are the benefits of code coverage? I know the answer to this question already.
Yeah, I mean, code coverage is really important because obviously it gives you a metric of, well, it definitely gives you a metric of what's not covered. So you definitely know that something needs to be tested if it has no coverage. If it does have coverage, that doesn't really mean, still doesn't mean you're okay to go, but it's definitely a way to see like what needs unit testing.
What does coverage mean?
And what does coverage mean? Yeah. I mean,
it's a quiz.
I mean, so coverage is basically it's telling you during the run of your test suite which lines ran and which lines didn't, and also how many times each line ran. So if you run PHPUnit code coverage and look at it can generate an HTML output, which is really nice. If you can like add it to your Jenkins build, you'll actually be able to see what tests ran like which lines just by like hovering over the line. Obviously it'll show you what lines aren't covered at all. It also gives you metrics on the crap factor, CRAP, which I forget what that stands for, but that simultaneously gives you some metrics on not just the coverage, but how likely that piece of code is to fail due to the number of like paths in that and complexities in that method. And it combines that with the coverage factor to give you like a number where you could see like what's kind of to attack first.
Cool.
Yeah. So.
Awesome. Thank you.
Cool.
Round of applause. All right, we're going to take a 5-minute break and then going to kick off with our next talk. Okay, everyone, if you'd like to take your seats for our highlight talk of the evening. We've got some folks in from HelloFresh this evening, all the way from Germany. And we've got one from New York, I believe, maybe a couple more. And over to you, basically. Thank you. Round of applause.
So thank you very much for joining me today for this talk. Yeah, as Oli was just saying, I came from Berlin, so bear with me. I'm a bit jet lagged, so if I start losing my focus halfway through, you would know what this is about. So today I'll be talking about harnessing the power of narrative, which comes as part of a series that I'm trying to develop at the moment. It's still a work in progress concept. I've done one blog post, and this is the second part of the series, and it's called Lessons in Engineering Leadership. So I hope you like it, and I would really like to get some feedback in the end on how to like polish the concept a bit. So please find me afterwards. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So to start with, a little bit about myself. My name is Mohannad. I currently work as VP Engineering at HelloFresh. I'm based in Berlin, but I'm leading all the engineering teams, currently delivering all the products and features that our customers actually use in their hands, as in I'm not focusing on any of the backend work or like the supply chain kind of software. So we have teams working in the consumer-facing organization in Berlin and New York City, but the bigger engineering organization has been historically in Berlin. I was lucky enough also to sort of join the company at the right point in time. And together with my colleagues, we participated into scaling up the engineering organization around 15 times within the last 3 years. So we scaled up the team from around 15 people around the time I joined to a little over 200 today, and growing at the rate of 15 to 20 people every month. So it's quite exciting times. And finally, I come from Egypt, so I think that plays into the story as well. So we'll see that in a couple of slides. Just quickly, a little bit about HelloFresh. We are the global leader in the meal kit industry at the moment. So basically what that means, we deliver meal kits to your doorstep, where you can get to enjoy delicious home-cooked meals without having to worry about coming up with the recipes to cook or doing the grocery shopping. We do all of that for you, and we send you all the ingredients pre-portioned, no waste, so you get to enjoy this kind of delicious meal with your family. We're currently present in 11 geographies. This slide is a bit outdated because we recently launched France like last week, so it's not on the map, but we're now present in the northern part of France as well. As of last quarter, we're the #1 player in all major territories. There are a couple of other territories we're still getting there, but because they're the more recent launches, and yeah, we've been growing quite quickly, especially in the US. The US is our biggest market so far, and it makes up around 60% of our group revenue. And we're still aggressively growing the team here and growing as the market leader here as well. We've grown within the last 5 years as a company, from a company that was doing around 2 million euros in revenue in 2012 to a company that has a run rate of $1.5 billion at this point. So it's has been quite the journey. Just a quick recap on HelloFresh so I can get this part over. Just in numbers, where do we stand today? Our customers are currently in close to 2 million households worldwide. Last quarter alone, we've shipped close to 50 million meals. And yeah, we have more than 10,000 recipes that we have developed ourselves. And we have around 3,000 employees working across the different geographies, right? But enough about HelloFresh. I want to get into the topic and to the story that I want to tell you today. So, to get into the theme of my talk today, I want to tell you how it all started for me. For me, this whole idea of thinking about narrative started in 2011, after the Egyptian revolution has happened. A few months after we actually went through the revolution in January 2011, where the Egyptian people have revolted against like a 3 decades dictator, Hosni Mubarak. We found ourselves for the first time in our lives, and a lot of people my age, faced with the challenge of going through free and democratic legislative election. And it's something that we haven't gone through before. And at this point in time, we started realizing that this is like revolutions are a lot more than just ousting one dictator and changing the head of the state. There's a lot more to this. You can imagine like 3 decades of no like political atmosphere where you get to grow your political parties and get to think about how you want to build the future. You found yourself post a revolutionary moment where the revolutionary narrative doesn't really cut it anymore, and you have to think about the future, you have to think about winning elections, and you have to think about lots of things. So we had this political gap, we had this political vacuum, and we were going into the legislative elections just thinking, okay, what can we do to win? How can we bring about political change? How can we bring about social change? And I was walking to the ballot in my area where I was supposed to vote. I was walking there with a friend, and we were discussing like the different parties and how some of them are probably more ready to actually pitch and campaign for what they believe in and so on, versus like the more revolutionary camp are not really in that state. And there's something that he told me at the time that has resonated really, really well with me. And I think this is where I started thinking about this idea of narrative. And what he basically told me is that to bring about change, our most powerful tool is the narrative. In order to win, we need to be able to tell a better story. If you put this in the political context of where this has all started, a lot of people were very scared in this political vacuum that happened after the revolution. You got to this point where there is a lot of uncertainty. And it's one thing going through like political campaigning and saying, hey, we're going to do this and this and this. But it's a different thing when you're able to tell a good story. You're able to tell like an end-to-end sequence of events that gives people security, gives people hope for prosperity, and so on and so forth, right? So with that quote that my friend told me that day has kept resonating in my head over the years in different contexts and different things. And today in my current job, I still find it something that is extremely, extremely important in how we should, as leaders, think about the different things and how we do our day-to-day work. And through this talk, I'll try to talk about how I see narrative contributing to how we run our teams and how we run our companies, and how it could have an impact on motivation, how we deliver things, and how we actually bring about change within the organizations as well. So taking it a bit from the top, So what is narrative, right? So mandatory Wikipedia definition. Narrative is a story. A narrative or story is a report of connected events presented in a sequence of written or spoken words, right? So as the code, like the very primitive code in Wikipedia suggests, we're simply talking about like good storytelling, right? And the question that came to me, why is narrative so important, right? And I've been trying to like do a bit of research around it to try to understand why is narrative such an essential tool. And this is what I came up with. One, it's human nature to think in narratives. Our brains are wired in a way to think in narratives, and we can digest information a lot easier and much better way if we hear it in story form. I think if you think about, for example, how we teach kids things, a very big tool on how we actually get to educate children about different concepts that might be very difficult for them to grasp is through storytelling. It's through like the books where they learn about things like morality and other like more complicated concepts. So our brains are wired in a way to think in narratives. Secondly, stories are more effective than facts. And I think in this day and age, it's really hard to argue against that. We have seen historically that facts count for, they don't really count for much when faced with a much more powerful story. This is not to say that we should like not use facts in our narrative, but I'm saying like stories are a very, very effective way to actually present facts and just like presenting facts in raw form. And finally, research has shown that even if you're someone who likes to read, for example, literary fiction, it actually increases the theory of mind, which is your capacity to actually be able to understand different perspectives. And this is because when you listen or read a good story, you actually have this opportunity to practice perspective taking, which is the cognitive skill necessary for having empathy, which allows you then to be able to take the other person's standpoint and be able to understand where they're coming from, right? So with this in mind, like it's clear to me that narrative is something that is extremely important. And I think for software engineers, narrative is not necessarily something that is a foreign concept. We use narrative every day in our day-to-day. If you think about it, user stories is a way that we have found to actually kind of use narrative to create alignment that was otherwise missing. If you think about the history of the software industry, pages and pages of functional requirements are not as effective in understanding what a real feature should do versus a simple user story that comes in this form, that presents an actor, right? I, as a person, it presents a premise of what this person needs to do. And also it presents, like more importantly, the purpose of why this person wants to do this thing, right? And I think that we can all agree that this has been the most effective way to be able to really understand what your user wants to do a certain thing and how to communicate this between different people and different teams. But I think engineers actually like took it even a step further. Oops. Wait, yeah. We took it a bit a step further. If you think about BDD, and if we think about Gherkin, for example, we have found a way to actually weave narrative into our code, right? We have, in a way, been able to, if you look at something like this, you set the stage, you tell the story of how your actors are going to behave, and you actually describe also the ending of the story, right? So narrative is not necessarily a foreign concept to how we work in a day-to-day. But today, my focus is entirely different from this. I'm not going to talk about the specifics of the day-to-day to engineers, since this is coming as part of, as I said, like a lessons in engineering leadership series. I'm going to talk about how to use narrative for engineering leaders. I think every leader, and I think this talk in general will be also relevant to a lot of people who are not necessarily from engineering disciplines, but yeah. I think are also very good for engineers. So I think as a leader, you need to become a better storyteller, and I think you need to understand the power of a good story. And I think you need to be able to, when you think about your customers, when you think about your users, when you think about your team, you need to have the capacity to put yourself in their shoes and write a story from their side, right? Dr. Howard Gardner, professor of Harvard University, says stories constitute the single most powerful weapon in a leader's arsenal, and this is something that I honestly very strongly believe in. The first form of narrative that we can use as leaders that I want to talk about is strategic narrative. the way I see it, strategic narrative is, or strategic stories are the kind of stories that could allow you to set the stage, introduce dramatic conflict into like with the story that you're saying about your company. It outlines the challenges that you're facing and how you're going to reach a resolution. And it also outlines like the organization's approach to the future in light of these challenges and where in light of like the stage that they have set. And I'd like to give you an example of this. This is actually a HelloFresh example. To the slide I was talking about earlier, right now, the being the #1 player everywhere, this is something that we only accomplished this year, right? And this has been something that has been a goal that we have been going after. But I want you to imagine how this could be a completely different narrative when you communicate it to your team. It's one thing going to your team and saying, like, hey, in the US, this is our market share, this is our revenue numbers, this is our revenue growth, and we need to get these numbers up by 5%, 7%, 10%, right? That's one thing to say it, and it's an entirely different narrative if the ambitious goal that you're going after is becoming #1 everywhere, right? This creates a different kind of understanding of focus, of alignment, of ambition that you do not necessarily get out of just saying, putting your goals in specific, like in raw numbers and just saying, hey, like it's 5% here, 3% there, and so on. A strategic narrative, in my opinion, also could be a special kind of story, right? It could be a story that says who you are as a company, where you have been, where you are today, and where you're going, how you believe value is being created and what you value in your relationships. And it explains why you exist and what makes you special. If you think about it, company missions are a great example of how, like, of these kind of special narratives, right? If you look at Uber's company mission, for example, when they say transportation as reliable and as running water everywhere for everyone, it makes it very, very clear how this company thinks about value and what they think is important. And if you can imagine, like in your day-to-day as a person working in this company, you automatically understand what friction points that you need to get rid of. You understand what is valuable to your work and what's not. And this will allow you to have much better focus, much better prioritization, much better understanding of what features are actually worthwhile for your customers and what's not. You know, if you're going towards this vision, it makes it extremely crystal clear of how you want to go after this. Another HelloFresh example that I think it's just to put in another engineering example. So we're a company that is very young in age. We started out in the end of 2011, early 2012. And until 2013, we have been a very, very small engineering team. When you're startups this size, you're bootstrapping, you're always looking for you're trying to optimize for the runway of 6 months, 9 months, and so on. So you don't really get to grow your talent and grow your tech stack as much as you can during these times. But then in the later years, we had the luxury of having a much bigger engineering team with good talent and so on. And we started going through the journey that a lot of companies go through of monolith to microservices, right? So through the years we've been doing like different efforts and like things have been going well. We've been building a few microservices, but as the team was doubling in size every year, we got to this point in time last year where we felt like we're starting to lose a bit of focus. We're trying to lose a bit of understanding of how the overall system looks like. And we started feeling a bit that we're losing sense of what is the highest priority refactors that we should actually go after and what's something that could come at later points. So we started kicking off this exercise of what we call like the 2020 technology strategy. And the story that we're telling with the strategy is basically we looked at the company today and we looked at where the company wants to go in 2 years. So this is basically what we have done through the document that we have came up with. This is where we are today. This is how we see the business going in 2 years. And this is what it takes to get there, right? And then we try to translate this into an understanding of how the system should look like to accommodate this kind of business vision. And then we thought about it in terms of domains, microservices, and so on. I'm going to spare you the details, but basically we also went through an exercise of prioritization where we understand what is of high business value now, what is of high business value in the future, and what is neither, right? And through this very long, very well prioritized list of priorities, but also like this deep understanding of where the story is going, this created automatic alignment within teams. Like up from that point onwards, like people understand, okay, like this is the part of the bigger picture that I need to be working on over the course of the next 2 years, or this is the direction I have to keep in mind when I'm working on my microservice. But also I found teams coming up to me telling me like, hey, this part of that system that no one is working on is actually something that we'll be working on right now because we feel that this is the missing piece we need for this. So just by transforming like your efforts into a story of how the business is evolving and how you want to go about refactoring as part of a bigger narrative, created like instant alignment, and we found that there is a much better coordination or orchestration of the efforts that we're having. Another form of narrative that I would like to talk about is also coaching through narrative. Right? It's obviously very clear to everyone that we as engineering leaders, big part of our jobs is actually coaching our teams. Your job is to increase their capacity for problem solving and being able to be more autonomous and do things on their own. And when it comes to actually learning or teaching someone something, it's a lot about changing attitudes and behaviors that have been acquired through experiences and relationships in the past. And these attitudes and behaviors have been actually ingrained through a process that the brain loves the most, which we talked about earlier, which is a narrative framework, right? And in my opinion, like the best way to try to actually influence this is also through the same framework, through a narrative framework. It's very easy for someone to subscribe to a story that has worked for them in the past, but if you want to grow and if you want to like explore the edges of opportunity, it's really important to try to get yourself in the habit of trying to change the story, changing narrative, and actually doing this kind of like storytelling of experiences to be able to influence how your teams approach different problems. So it happens quite often when someone comes to you with a problem, you have a natural inclination when you know the answer to just give them the answer, to give them the solution about things. But I think this is counterproductive when it comes to the overall learning experience. It's really important to try to walk them through the story of how you actually got to acquire that particular experience that allows you to be able to address this problem. You can walk them through the problem as, okay, when this happened before, this is what happened, this was said, this is how I thought about the problem, and this is what I learned out of it, right? So you can also make them walk through the same kind of story that you went through and be able to come up with their own learnings as well. Another mandatory quote. So Thomas A. Stewart says, nothing serves a leader better than a knack for narrative. Stories anoint role models, impart values, and show how to execute indescribably complex tasks. I think this is a good example of why, like when you do coaching through narrative, it makes it a lot more clearer why this is the right way to do things and why this is not the right way, but why this is a good way to do things, because it has a lot of complexity other than just giving a solution. It has people in it, it has values in it, it have a lot of things. It gives you more than the why and the what and the how of the story. It gives you the reason why to care, gives you the reason why you should actually do all of these things. Another form of really important narrative that I think is very important to keep in mind is what I call like the DNA narrative, or the narrative about the culture that you have in the team. I think this is mainly about stories of how you got to be where you are today. It's about the hopes, the struggles, the things you had to accomplish over the years, the things you couldn't accomplish over the years. So basically what defines you as people, what defines you as a team. And I think these stories give your employees a sense of belonging and a feeling of being part of something that has substance, and it gives them also pride to be part of this team and feeling they are part of this journey of like the company. A good example of this kind of narrative, I think, is the Amazon Day One narrative. I think this is an extremely, extremely powerful narrative. The way Jeff Bezos puts it, I think in last year's or the 2016 shareholders letter, he was talking about, this is like a very old concept at Amazon, to the point that even like the building where his office is called Day One. And the way he describes it is that every day at Amazon is Day One. It's like starting new every single day, because Day Two is stasis. Day Two is when you start having irrelevance, followed by excruciating, painful decline, followed by death, right? And this is why, I mean, quote unquote, how Jeff Bezos described it, this is why it's always Day One at Amazon. With this kind of narrative going on, with this kind of story of how Amazon operates, it changes a lot how people think about everyday problems. It changes a lot how people think about long-term strategy versus short-term strategy and so on. You could also hear it in a different interview, for example, when he's saying, when someone comes to congratulate him about a good quarter, he doesn't really understand why they're congratulating him about a good quarter, because that quarter, that is a good quarter, was already done like 2 years ago. And today he's working on a quarter that is 4 quarters in the future, and so on. So this kind of understanding of where is your starting point when you think about problems changes a lot how you address a lot of things. Another example from Amazon as well is this kind of door chair table, which is a testament to how frugal everyone in Amazon is. Being the 4th biggest company in the world does not stop them from understanding the value of the dollar and being very frugal about a lot of things. So when you have this kind of narrative, it also dictates how people feel responsible at how they spend the company money and so on. A HelloFresh example, which is something that is close to my heart. I think one of the things that we take a lot of pride in, what we call like the HelloFresh war room, which is, I mean, you guys are all engineers. Everyone went through a couple of war rooms in their work. But I like we have a couple of stories that I find like extremely personal, extremely heartwarming as well. One of which, Nuno, our CTO, he likes to tell the story about how in the early days, I think it was Christmas 2014, they weren't even on AWS. They were on this data center, I think in Spain somewhere. And Monsanto was getting DDoSed and they took the whole data center down. Anyway, a big disaster, Christmas Day. He just had a baby at the time. He was back home with his family. And at night, during Christmas dinner, he's doing a migration to AWS with the entire stack with the baby in one hand and, like a lot of things. And I find the story like extremely heartwarming. And like when he tells the story about how he had to do this and like how later on, a couple of hours later, engineers from all over the world, like because our team was from lots of different places, they started like logging in to also help him with the migration. And within 12 hours, they were already done with the whole thing. It's not a story to celebrate like long hours. It's not a story to celebrate like doing a lot of work, but it's a story to celebrate how everyone came together and how like they really had this kind of ownership and how they wanted to make sure that even on Christmas night, they will make sure that this problem is solved. Another like war room situation, we also have this engineer called Maxime, which is a famous like in every company you have these kind of engineers who are like the firefighters who are jumping on problems every time, and Maxime is one of these guys. But the stories that we have around Maxime, the emojis we have on Slack for Maxime and all of these things are like a celebration of how Maxime is extremely helpful, extremely super supportive. It's like the kind of like the ballads of, the stories that people say about like heroic acts from certain people and so on. Maxime has this kind of reputation within the team. And again, it's not a narrative of saying like, hey, Maxime does extremely crazy long hours and so on, but it's just a good story about how someone deeply cares about everything else in the system and is always there to support his colleagues. So these kind of stories are stories we like to celebrate, and we like to make sure that they are in the public discourse or like the day-to-day discourse of the team. And speaking of day-to-day discourse, one of the other things about narrative that I think are extremely, extremely important, and I think I saved the most important one in my opinion, or at least in how I see it, to the last, is how we use narrative for actually bringing about organizational change or change within your team. The concept I would like to introduce you today in that sense is called appreciative inquiry. I'm not sure if some of you guys are familiar with it or not, but basically it was developed at Case Western Reserve University. I had to read this name because I keep forgetting it. Department of Organizational Behavior, and basically the concept is based on that they felt that there's an overuse of the expression problem solving, right? They felt that this overuse of the expression problem solving is hampering actually any kind of social improvement we're trying to do. And they felt the need that we needed to develop new methods of inquiry that allow us to generate new ideas and models for how to organize ourselves. They realized that organizations are actually created and maintained and changed through the conversations of people within the organization. And the methods of organizing were just limited by how people perceive things and how they imagine things. So in the mid-80s, if you think about it, all the methods for organizational change or methods for inquiry and assessment were all deficiency-based models, right? We're always thinking about what's the problem we want to solve, what is missing, what needs to be fixed, And when they tried to be a bit more progressive about it, they said everyone tells you like, hey, move away from the idea of the problems, think about challenges and so on, which is still a deficiency-based model. But if you think about it, what they have done with appreciative inquiry actually is that it's the first serious managerial framework that actually focuses on what works instead of what doesn't work. It focuses on the positive core and focuses on what actually people care about within the organization. It advocates a collective inquiry into what is actually working today, imagining what could be, and then collectively designing as future state that is so compelling that it doesn't require coercion, it doesn't require incentive, it doesn't require persuasion for people to actually bring about this change. It's based on a few concepts that I would like to walk you through very quickly from the bottom up. So the first concept is called the poetic principle, five principles. The poetic principle basically says that we, if we think about how organizations are actually created through like the day-to-day conversations of people and like they actually change through the day-to-day conversations, then there's a lot of value in making sure that when we talk, when we think about the organization, is that we have this kind of very positive outlook on things, you know? So first of all, you have this kind of positive attention in the present. The second principle is the anticipatory principle. It basically says that whatever we do today is actually based on an image we have of the future. Human systems are in a constant state of projecting horizontal, like projecting, timelines in the future of how the future would look like, and they have a way to sort of bring it back into the future as a mobilizing agent and how we should do things today. So with that, we need to be thinking positively or projecting a positive future image of how things should be. The simultaneity principle says that the questions that we actually ask are never neutral. Like the questions themselves are always faithful and they guide actually the learnings that we get through it, the things that people think about and so on. So if you're always thinking a negative question, this is what you're gonna end up with. But if you're always thinking a positive question, how to get things to be better and so on, this is will lead the entire transformation of your organization and how you're thinking about things. The constructionist principle is actually says that what we think is true is what's going to happen, and that the organization, as I was saying, is being actually written through the stories and through the day-to-day discourse, and this story is being constantly co-authored by everyone within the organization. I'm mindful of that, sorry. And finally, the last concept is this positive principle, is that through the entire discourse, through every exercise you do, you always need to wrap all of this in like very positive sentiment of camaraderie, of empathy, of making sure that everyone is trying to put as many positive emotion as you can into the whole exercise. So if you think about how the whole process looks like, it's basically a process of discovery where you think about, okay, what is actually working really well for our organization? You start dreaming about what might be. Imagine how good things could actually be, and then through this idea of how good things could be, start designing actually what would be like the ideal scenario on how to get there. And then the destiny will come is that you actually, when people participate in this kind of exercise, you're actually empowering and learning, and you're actually achieving the kind of positive change that you wanted to have. And finally, I would like to give an example of the opposite kind of narrative, where how narrative could be extremely destructive within your organization. If you look at this picture, this doesn't make any sense, right? Like this elephant is not really held to the floor by this small peg of wood and this tiny rope. This elephant is actually held in place by its own belief system, right? And the concept I would like to talk about, it's what's called the learned helplessness, right? The theory states that when a creature experiences adversity where it believes that it cannot control or escape, the creature will just stop trying, right? And in the case of the elephant, like the theory, the way described, the example they give about the elephant is that the elephant has gone through a lot of conditioning through beating, electrocution, and so on and so forth, that it got to the point where the conditioning itself became the story, right? Like the thoughts of why bother, right? I can't get away anyway. Like I'm helpless, because then this becomes the narrative, and therefore, even if you remove the conditioning factors, this is the narrative that this elephant is trapped in. If we try to reflect this in the workplace, we have a lot of these things going on, right? So I've seen it happen actually on both sides of the pond. I've seen it happening from management where they foster this kind of destructive narrative, but I've seen it also happening on people themselves where they've sponsored this narrative by themselves, right? So one, if you're someone in leadership and you're not fostering a culture where people get to feel that their contribution and how things are going, and like they can actually feel that they can bring about change, and they try to do it and they get shut down over and over again, then you are perpetually putting them in this kind of state where even if you try to do the changes kind of perception later, it will be extremely, extremely difficult, because once you fall into the cycle, it becomes really hard to get out of. But I've also seen it the other way around, where you have people just thinking about things like, we've always done it this way, you know? When you go talk to someone about an idea and to do something, and they're always saying like, we're too busy for that, for example. Or when someone is trying to introduce new policies or things, and everyone is like, yeah, these new policies are great, but no one's gonna do it anyway. There is sometimes this kind of like self-fulfilling prophecy where people put themselves in this kind of constant victimization, and they feel like they create this kind of helplessness state in themselves. And I think this is something that we have to be constantly conscious of. And how can we manage this kind of conversation where we have enough contribution from people, we leave room for challenging things, but at the same time allow room for disagreement without getting into the state where we're trapped by our own belief systems and our own understanding of things. So to summarize, I think this is to get the code that I started with. I think it's a good wrapping for the whole talk. So to bring about change, our most powerful tool is narrative. And in order to win, we need to be telling a better story. I think this is something we need to constantly remind ourselves with, and make sure that we're always telling a very good story in how we do things on the day-to-day. Last but not least, I have to do this. So yes, we're hiring. We're growing our team exponentially. We're growing the team here in New York, as well as in Berlin. We're hiring hundreds of positions across the globe. If you know anyone working in anything that is talented, but mainly we're looking for talented tech people in New York specifically. We have a PHP and Golang stack, where also we have internal training programs. We're constantly training PHP developers to become Go developers. Of course, like as I was saying, like we're going through a transformation where we're building a lot of microservices from the systems that we have. We've built some really cool tooling around Kubernetes as well that if you're interested, I can tell you about in a different talk. And finally, we have free food, like free boxes. If you want to try a HelloFresh box, go to Joanne in the back. She has some vouchers for you guys. And yeah, that's it. And I'm happy to take your questions.
Who has questions? Come on. Okay, I have questions.
Yes.
Well, first one is more of a anecdote / story. On the destructive narrative point. So you mentioned that destructive narrative is something that is sort of an internal belief system that is just the way things are.
Yeah.
So there's an anecdote about a science experiment that was done with some monkeys in a cage.
Yep.
So the anecdote goes as follows. There's some scientists and they're testing out behavioral patterns amongst monkeys. So they have 5 monkeys in a cage, and there's a ladder in the center of the cage, and at the top of the cage, there's a bunch of bananas. So the monkeys are all sitting there, they're looking at the bananas thinking, we need to get those bananas. First monkey climbs up the ladder. As he gets to touching the banana, the scientist sprays them all with freezing cold water. Monkey falls down, and all the monkeys are like, yo, what the hell? We just wanted the banana. Second monkey goes to try. Exactly the same thing happens. Scientist sprays them with cold water. Third monkey goes to climb up the ladder. All the other monkeys go, yo, we're going to get sprayed with cold water. Don't you do that. They pull him down and they beat him. None of the other monkeys decide to go up the ladder at this point. They're all thinking, I know what's going to happen. Scientist takes monkey number 1 out of the cage and puts monkey number 6 in the cage. Monkey number 6 sees the bananas and goes, I'm going to get me some bananas. Monkey goes to go up the ladder. They pull him down, they beat him. Each monkey gets taken out in turn until none of the original monkeys are still in the cage. None of them ever go up the ladder. Why not?
I think it just they have seen how everyone has been doing it. They don't really understand the reasoning behind, like the baggage that led to this. But they just got conditioned into the same kind of public consciousness that everyone has. And
all of those new 5 monkeys never got sprayed with water.
Yeah, it's exactly like you're saying. It's the belief system that
they were coding. Yeah, maybe that's the answer. No, it plays into this idea of that's just the way we do things around here.
Yeah.
When you enter into a new organization and you see something strange and you say, hey, well, that goes against what I've experienced in the past. Why do you do it like that? And if the response is, well, that's just how we do it around here, that's a destructive narrative.
Absolutely.
This was super interesting. I think everybody here should be able to take something away from this to apply to their organizations. Oh, we actually have questions now. Cool.
So I'm sure many people have experience coming into a new tech company and things were done a certain way. I've definitely experienced that. But my question is, how do we differentiate between destructive narrative when it's only done a certain way because of a reason no one knows, and actual practical because there's some specific idiosyncrasy in their stack and the way that it will not necessarily work?
Yeah, I think the answer to this question is it's literally about the narrative that you use to relay the same message, right? It could be that you have to do it a certain way. One way to go about this is just saying, hey, this is just how we do things. Just get in line, do it like how everyone else is doing it. It's another explaining all of these things, explaining actually where you come from. Like when you say specificities of a particular system, usually always has something to do with historical events. Like this is how we've done it in these years because we were bootstrapped for people, or we didn't have the resources, or this or that, right? I think explaining this kind of flow, explaining the story behind why we're doing it a certain way, I think can give you this kind of alignment. And back to the point that I was saying earlier about coaching, right? When you want to teach someone something and how to do a certain thing, it's very counterproductive if you just tell them like, hey, do it this way, right? But if they learned it a certain way and they're saying it's a certain way because they learned it through a particular also narrative framework, and it's important to give them an alternative narrative framework to think and reason through your suggestion, to reason about your suggestion through as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have any examples of where you've had a narrative that wasn't working and how you changed it according to the slides that you've had up? Maybe from a destructive one to a positive one, or a coaching narrative, like anything that comes to mind that you've implemented at HelloFresh that you've seen a demonstrable change in the output of the teams or response to problems?
That's a good question. I mean, off the top of my head, I can think of like one big topic, especially when it comes to the coaching narrative. I think it's a lot of because when it comes to coaching through narrative, this is something that you would mostly do within one-on-one conversations you're having with people in your team and so on. So it's not necessarily that you do like a big exercise around these things. I mean, appreciative inquiry is one of the things you could do like a large-scale exercise around, but we haven't done this. But I think like the concepts that you can derive around these things are things you do on a micro scale every single day. I think it's just creating this narrative. I'll give you an example of, now that I think of it, I think one destructive narrative that I was seeing, and what I literally did is actually give people the feedback that I feel this is a bit of a destructive narrative, and I think they should change how they approach it. Which is basically, there was this one project this team was working on, which is to what I was saying earlier, like the France launch we did last week. There was a team working on this, as you can imagine, launching a new country has so many dependencies on all different teams. And I think there were just like poor planning through the process. So a lot of these dependencies came with a lot of friction. People were not really anticipating the kind of support they have to provide this team at this point in time, and so on and so forth. Typical misplanning situation. But what happened is, one of these teams came to me with an Excel sheet logging like 5 minutes and 10 minutes and 15 minutes of support they have given to another team, right? And they have escalated a situation where they're coming and telling me like, hey, we feel like this is wasn't very good planning and blah, 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 and we want to escalate this to you, right? So what I've done immediately is that I told them like, this is something that I think we should not even be having a conversation around, because I think this is just like really bad narrative that fosters an us versus them situation where we're all working to the same goal. You have a problem, the first thing you should do is talk with the team, understand how you can work it out together, how you can do it better next time, and so on. And the moment we start logging 5 minutes and 10 minutes of how we support each other, this is the moment we start failing automatically, right? And like the feedback I gave was entirely around the narrative, because I see merit in what they're saying, right? I see merit in the misplanning we had in this situation, but I completely disagree with how they handled the situation. And it's all about the language they use, and it's about the ask you ask of people to think about these things. It's one thing saying, in the retrospective, we have to think about how to do this better. It's another thing saying, log how many minutes you're helping your colleague with. Even if you're trying, I understand like it came from good intentions. The manager at the time is trying to get data to use in a different conversation on better planning next time, to understand how much time it actually takes to do a lot of these things. But a lot gets lost in the narrative. If you just tell someone log minutes, it doesn't work this way, So it's a lot of these like small things that I think just a positive narrative on how you bring people together and how they think about problems goes a long way. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Do you want to pass the mic down?
Yeah, but he's from HelloFresh. It doesn't count.
Yeah, I don't count. Actually, to add, sort of replying to your own question, and Mohannad mentioned like the power of one-on-ones to sometimes use narrative precisely. One thing that I remember is that with one of my reports, the narrative, I felt that I needed to mess a little bit with his pride. And I told him that I don't feel like you're a lead right now. This person was a front-end chapter lead and still is. And the narrative was, I don't think you're a chapter lead. And this obviously will not work with everyone. So I had to tread carefully there. But it was also coupled with the necessary support, and the necessary a little bit of hand-holding in certain respects. And this narrative actually turned a destructive behavior and destructive narrative into something that was positive and constructive. And right now, he is really performing as one of our most sophisticated leaders in the organization. So that would be one thing. But my question for Mohannad is going back to the title of your presentation and harnessing the power of narrative. Do you think the power of narrative, in your opinion, is a skill? Do you think it can be acquired and learned? And what do you think that we as engineering organizations are doing for that?
So I generally don't think anything is, I'm not a believer in inherent leadership and like these kind of things. I think these are all things we learn and we develop and experiences we build up over the years. So in that sense, I don't think it's a talent. I think the power, like the becoming better storytellers and using narrative in your day-to-day is something that you can acquire. I can't think right now, to be honest, like to answer your question, I don't necessarily understand how we can do this at scale. I don't think you should give training about people to like engineers to give like to become better storytellers.
I guess just to complement my question, what I'm trying to get at is that as engineering leaders and engineering managers, usually the focus is a lot on the tech.
Yeah.
Not so much sometimes on the people side and on developing this more sort of soft skills that really, especially in engineering managers towards other engineers, really make a difference, as you demonstrated throughout your presentation.
I think it makes a huge difference, right? I think also some of the examples that I've given, it sees how this applies to a lot of more technical organizational things. I don't expect someone to use narrative in a code review. It doesn't make sense, right? But if the way you plan your work, the way you think about overall the future of your architecture, the way you design your systems and so on, I think narrative goes a long way.
I think one of my colleagues would vehemently disagree that the use of narrative in code reviews is not relevant. He actually gave an excellent talk at the last month's meetup, specifically on reviewing pull requests like a human.
Nice, I would love to see this one.
I'm going to try and get him to do it again, and hopefully we'll record it so we can send it to you in Germany.
Okay, perfect.
Any more questions? One more. Oh, one at the front, one at the back.
I need to premise that I'm not an engineer. I'm in HR. And the reason I came here is because I was delighted to see the engineering groups to really be so focused on this. Mm-hmm. And I really wanted to hear what you were going to say, because this is what I live every day, right? And my question is, was this approach something that came to you because the company really believed in it and they started really saying, this is part of our norms. This is who we are. This is how we're going to operate. And we believe in this, and we're going to hire people that believe in this. And you just found it that it really fit you. You thought, this really makes sense. Or did you actually bring it inside the company, and because you experienced the value of it and you decided to champion it?
Yeah, to be completely honest, I don't think it's a HelloFresh thing, but it's also not like a me thing in that sense. For me, for example, something like appreciative inquiry, it's something I learned about when I was in college. I attended this talk once where someone gave a really good presentation on how to think about change, organization change through appreciative inquiry. So that I think was a kind of a trigger. But I think especially in the tech team in HelloFresh, so you have to understand that we have a very specific mindset when it comes to how we operate as a company. We're a hyper-growth organization with a very different growth mindset. But I think that tech organization specifically just to the, not necessarily to chance, but I think it has a lot to do with our CTO as well, which I think is someone who, if I would describe his management style, I think it's like people-centric growth mindset and not just growth mindset. And I think this is something, if I look at the leadership team that we have, it's a leadership team that sometimes has too much philosophy within the team for our own good, you know. So I think we go through a lot of exercises. Like Paulo, for example, is someone that I work with a lot, and we exhaust each other just like bouncing off ideas of each other, and like we go at length discussing things that are entirely philosophical, but also trying to make it extremely pragmatic. And I think just over the years, you develop your management style in a way. And I don't necessarily expect everyone to develop the same management style. It's not like I would like to prescribe this, but it's just that I don't feel like I'm doing enough in how I want to use narrative in my management style as well. But it's definitely something that I like, and it's something that I try to suggest to people when I'm doing one-on-ones and so on. Yeah, if we would do a more organized approach around it, I have no idea. We'll see.
All right, thank you. We only have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask, if you want to ask your question, let's make our way to Central Bar, which is just one block over. Hopefully you'll all come and join us. We can chat further. And on your way out, make sure you grab a gift card from Joanna at the back there in the black top. And thank you ever so much for coming. If anybody is interested in speaking at the next meetup, which will hopefully be end of June or mid-July to counteract either side of the July 4th holiday, please get in touch with me. And thank you again all for coming. And thanks to our wonderful speaker, Mohannad Ali from HelloFresh.
Thank you, Rohit, for
thanks to others.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.